Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, Amy and I got our second dose of the Pfizer/BioNTech vaccine last Wednesday. Everyone's mileage is going to vary on the side effects, but I will admit we both got pretty walloped by dose number 2. I spent Thursday with fever, chills, body aches, mind-crushing headache, could barely sleep Thursday night, and then by Friday at noon, I was perfectly fine, and Amy had similar symptoms with differing severity and different timelines, but same thing. By lunchtime on Friday, it was like, okay, that's in the past, and it's pretty freaky to have all those symptoms and to know exactly why they're happening and to know that they're going to dissipate pretty quickly. Because, when I'm actually sick, I tend to feel like I will be in this state for the rest of my life and never know what it's like not to be sick. And, I'm a big baby. We'll just put it that way. But this time, I knew that the symptoms would pass, that they were just a sign that my immune system was going bananas while I leveled up on antibodies. And, well, honestly, Thursday morning, I thought I was okay and then took my dog around the corner for a walk, and I just started getting kind of short-tempered with him and realized, oh, that's just a cytokine thing. As you start to have an immune reaction, in some people you get irritable and angry, and that's what's happening right now, and it's just going to get worse. But I knew all that. So now it's in the past, and we get to figure out what our normal looks like and what we'll actually do when we can get out in the world. Just yesterday, I was planning on a hike with pretty much my oldest friend. His birthday's coming up this weekend, and I hit him up with, hey, we always go on these long hikes that you plan, and what's your vaccine status anyway? So by Memorial Day, he'll be up to full antibody levels, and we are planning to get out and go. So, anyway, enough about that. Let's get to this week's show. My guest this time is Louis Menand, the longtime New Yorker writer and author of the amazing new book, The Free World, Art and Thought in the Cold War, from FSG. The Free World, like I say, amazing, all-encompassing, fantastic book. It explores artistic, intellectual, and social movements in the West from the post-war era through the fall of Vietnam. Spoiler alert. But a description like that doesn't begin to do justice to Louis's book. Each chapter, really, it not only examines those different facets that I mentioned, and artistic means a lot of different things. There's cinema, abstract expressionism, the Black Mountain College people, the Beats, Warhol, and pop art, all these different areas. But it doesn't just go into the tenets of those movements, but really explores the people who made them happen. And he takes you everywhere. Some of the figures are obvious historical ones like Orwell and Sartre and Baldwin and John Cage, Susan Sontag. But, well, there's a whole lot of figures. But he also gets into we'll say the quote unquote minor figures, the ones who aren't, world renowned, but also turned out to be critically important to helping make the world that we know. It's just phenomenal the way he does this beautiful job of showing us these lives and how these characters came together and learned from one another and splintered away. And it just built so much of what we've come to take for granted. Now, a few times in our conversation, I use the word illuminating to describe the free world. And I still think it's the most appropriate term for this book. It shines a light on the society that arose in America and the UK and Europe after World War II, and the ways that art, culture, and philosophy and civil rights and other movements flowered and transformed, at times confounding our accepted notions of what the times were like. As Louis and I talk about, people think of the 50s as a stultifying age of conformity, but he really shows a lot of interesting nonconformist threads that come out of that era. But again, the book really shines in his threading together of those key characters. And in the intro, he admits that it can be a bit Tolstoyan in sprawl, but I will say he is up for the challenge. He really gets into the resonances of chance meetings and the social and practical forces that impact life and how we lived it. I learned a ton from The Free World, and I hope it becomes part of your library. Now, also, as I note at the end of our conversation, I pitched Louis on a podcast about The Free World before I looked up the details of the book. All I had was the publishing date. He said yes, and then I looked it up and realized The Free World is 880 pages long. But he assured me when I blanched in a subsequent email, it's only 727 pages before you get to the notes and index, and it's a quick read. I'm laughing, but listener, I am here to tell you he's right. The chapters are so varied in their topics. The characters and their times are so vivid. His writing is so fluid. It's a real page turner. So go pick up The Free World, Art and Thought in the Cold War. You will learn an awful lot, and you'll enjoy the heck out of the process. Now here's Louis' bio from The Free World. Louis Menand is professor of English at Harvard University and a staff writer at The New Yorker. His books include The Metaphysical Club, which won the Pulitzer Prize in History and the Francis Parkman Prize from the Society of American Historians. In 2016, he was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Barack Obama. His new book is The Free World, Art and Thought in the Cold War. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Louis Menand. Where did The Free World, as a book, originate for you? And how did it evolve in scope? I mean, did you know it was going to be Tolstoyan from the outset?
Yeah, no, I hope that it wouldn't. Well, it's a period I was always interested in thinking about. And I started teaching some of this material maybe 20 years ago and then dropped it for a long time. And then I felt that the period had become sufficiently dead or remote that it would be possible to do something disinterested with it. So that's why I really started working on the book. And that would be the writing part started about 10 years ago. Because I think that, I grew up in that period. I was very young, but I remember a lot of it pretty well. And it's hard to write historically about stuff that you have that kind of relationship with. So I felt like we got to a different place. I could write something that might be worthwhile. And then when you're writing a book, basically the first chapter or the first pages, you're stretching the canvas, and only then do you get an idea of what the scale needs to be for you to kind of realize whatever your vision was for the project. And I remember after finishing the first chapter, I went like, oh my God, this is going to be enormous. And it turned out to be enormous, but it was the only way I could, as I said, realize what I wanted to express was on that scale. So the advantage of it to me, the length, apart from scaring readers off probably, is just that you get more of a 50,000 foot view of this 20-year period by putting together lots of little pieces and not trying to overgeneralize about it. And then I think that ideally the reader, by reading these consecutively, can get a feel for the arc of change that takes place between 1945 and 1965. So to get that, I had to really populate the ground level stuff with lots of stories and examples, which gave me pleasure to write, but it was challenging.
I always have to ask, even at 727 pages, was there something you had to leave out? something you're just like, oh God, I wish I could include X in here?
Yes, there was quite a bit. So first of all, just this is not of interest to listeners, but I had to cut 75,000 words. So to get it down to that length, because I just thought 800 word, I don't like to read 800 page books, and I want readers to feel they have to read them. So I did cut actually quite a bit. It wasn't hard to do, but because I was writing it in this ground level way, there was plenty of stuff, underbrush I could cut out. I'd say the main regret I have about I left a ton of stuff out because, just the way it is. But the main regret is Japan, because the Japanese art scene was very interesting in the 50s and early 60s and had a big influence on particularly New York art scene and vice versa. And there's lots of good stories there having to do with the politics of post-war Japan. And I just couldn't master it enough, and I didn't have space enough to do it. Then there's all kinds of things that certain readers will probably be expecting to find that I didn't do, but would do if I had a chance to do it over again. So really important artistic phenomenon in this period is jazz. And I touch on it briefly, but it's obviously something that people give a lot of intellectual energy to understanding and appreciating, and plays a role, of course, in the racial politics of art. And a lot of the people I write about were very interested in it. So that's another thing that could easily have been given a little bit more space. And then, there's the whole question of science and big science and scientific thinking and so forth, that, having to do with atomic energy. And so there's like a million things. The main thing that I did cut was most of the cuts were about Trotsky. And that's because Trotsky was this very important figure for left-leaning intellectuals in the 30s who were disgusted with Stalinism, who wanted to maintain a kind of allegiance to at least the theory of Marxist communism. And Trotsky was the alternative. He was sort of communism with a human face, as it were. And of course, he was in exile most of all that decade, a lot of it in Mexico. And so people like Clement Greenberg, an art critic I talk about, a lot of the anti-communists like Trilling and so forth were interested in Trotsky. He was a very important figure, as were the surrealists, for example, even though Trotsky had little interest in art. So I had a lot of stuff about him. But he was assassinated in 1940. So it's kind of backstory to my story really starts in 1945. So I actually don't think it hurts the book to cut it out, but it was a little painful anyway.
Sure.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the story of how much of the power broker isn't in the power broker by Caro. There's apparently a whole, 600 more pages or so.
Yeah. Well, it's like we'll do a director's cut someday,
Yeah. I'll be there for it. I love this. So, but you mentioned, your immersion in this material and things you've taught over the years. What did you have to learn? What was new to you in the process of researching and writing this?
The whole thing. I mean, really, of course, everybody, you have a superficial knowledge of American history. You know who George Kennan was and so on. But George Kennan is the political figure who starts the book off with the theory of containment. And I had heard of all these people, and I had certain, sort of superficial understandings of them. But really, when you're writing something like this, you have to throw all that aside, and you just have to plunge into the primary material and try to reconstruct who the person was and what was going on. And in every case, I learned things that astonished me based on what I thought I knew, about who these people were and what they were really up to and what context gave their work importance, which is really what you're trying to get at. So yeah, it was writing a book like this. My earlier book, The Metaphysical Club, deals with a different period of American history. It's a similar experience, which is it's like an advent calendar where each day you open a little window and there's somebody in there and you hadn't known about before, and then this fascinating little story. So that part of it was pleasurable. The hard part was just climbing the Mount Everest part, but getting to the end. But it's always fun to discover these little stories about people and little things that you thought you knew or didn't know at all that shed a lot of light on what you're trying to explain.
Yeah, when you're working on a project of this scale, how do you organize or even, visually perceive it? I mean, There are metaphors like a road map or a tapestry. You mentioned a canvas earlier and a mountaintop just now. In the process, did you have any sort of guiding image or object that kind of correlated to what this all meant, or do we go with world in the fog, where you're kind of, moving your way through it, figuring out what the next page is and how it all comes together?
Well, you do. I mean, that is how you write. After all, you write a sentence, then you think, well, what should the next sentence be? And then you discover that sentence, and that's the same thing as you go chapter by chapter. What should the next chapter do? Obviously, I had a goal in mind, which was Vietnam. So I started in 1945. What do I need to do to get us to 1965, which is when the U.S. intervened militarily in Vietnam? And so the pieces then have a logic to them because they have to get you there. There's certain things you have to cover to get to that point. How you handle each topic depends on the topic itself and what you discover as you're writing it. So I try not to get distracted by a goal. In other words, everything has to lead to this and be explained by this, but that's sort of where that's the target the arrow is being shot at. And as you shoot the arrow, you follow it on its trajectory and you hope to steer it more and more to the bullseye of your target. The metaphor that I use for my writing is kicking a carpet. Ideally, you want the reader to feel it's just this road that you're walking down. It's inevitable. It's going to lead to where you want to go. And it doesn't feel like an effort to put the pieces together. You just turn the pages and then the carpet unrolls and you get there. And that's how I try to write. I just write one sentence at a time and try to figure out where the next sentence is going to go. And that's what was hard. And the Metaphysical Club was easier because it had a single, basically, plot. This one has multiple plots. So it was a little bit harder to sustain this feeling that there's a continuous story coming. But I hope that by the time you get to the end, you feel it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I found myself wondering whether the final chapter was going to be a summation, backwards looking at all this, or if you were going to move forward into something. And no spoilers, you pull off the latter really, really well.
Oh, good. Thank you. Yeah.
It was funny that there was a point reading it that I thought, in a weird way, it reminded me of Cultural Amnesia by Clive James, except you're not intruding personally, nor explaining to the reader how you learned to tango and everything else in the process. But still that sense of well, I guess the question I have, given how long you've been teaching, do students have any idea what the world was like?
No, that's why I wrote the book.
This. Okay, that's what I'm sort of wondering, because I try and explain to younger people, I'm 50 and we grew up with the bomb, as you grew up with it in an earlier and even more dangerous phase. Yeah. And I said, I know climate change and everything else, these are horrible long-term apocalypses, but we literally had this psychosis in the back of our head that the world could end without any reason that day. So, but how about you with students? And
that was my experience. So this is a long story. I don't want to bore everybody with it, but 20 years ago, I taught at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York, and I had a graduate class on the 60s that I designed. It was the first time I'd ever taught that kind of material. Incredible group of students, fantastic students. And we did, Betty Friedan, and we did Structure of Scientific Revolutions and Autobiography of Malcolm X and some movies and da-da-da. And we would I would start the class by talking about what people thought or thought about art or movies or so forth in the 50s, such that you could understand, or about the role of women, such that you could understand why these things in the 60s seemed radical or revolutionary or iconoclastic. And so we finished the class. I thought it was a great group of students. And I asked them, I was thinking of writing a book about the 60s. Would you be interested in it? And they all said no. And I actually went around there, 12 of them. I went around there and they go, no, I'm not interested in it. So I said, well, you seem to like the class. What did you like? They said, the stuff you said about the 50s was really interesting. Huh. And it's what you're saying, which is that they understood Betty Friedan. They know feminism. They know Structure of Scientific Revolutions. They know post-structuralism. It's like that stuff is obvious to them, or you can make a painting out of a soup can. It's not interesting. But abstract expressionism was interesting. And, the way people thought about art in the 40s and 50s was interesting. And so I realized that they don't know anything about this sort of before 1968. And that's to tell the story about American cultural history, you've got to start earlier, and that people will be interested in it because they don't remember it or don't really know it. And then years later, I usually teach other stuff, but years later at Harvard, I started teaching a course, a lot of which is in this book. And by then, students had no idea even who Andy Warhol was. So I felt that, and they were fascinated, about Duchamp and all that Dada. They were fascinated by it. And I realized for people of my generation, it's some sort of an old story, but not for kids. So I'm hopeful that I'll be younger demographic than I usually do in my readership for this book, because they won't have a lot of preconceived ideas about what this stuff was about, and they might be interested in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'd sort of wondered, I don't have kids, and I never have any idea what's going on with anybody younger than me. But yeah, that sense of history, I get it a little bit with cartooning, because I interview a lot of cartoonists, and some of the younger ones just don't know the roots and the precursors and all this stuff. And that goes back into a living memory as opposed to going back 100 years with these things. Right. But to that extent, were there any living sources you worked with on this, or was pretty much everything in terms of reading and records and films like Painter's Painting and things like that?
Yeah. I tried to use as much of the Painter's Painting type material or primary interviews with people as I could. And I indicated in the notes when the material comes from an interview, because that feels fresher than, with somebody's secondary literature on something. But I didn't interview people, with a couple exceptions, but I'll tell you in a second. But I kind of believe what Joe Didion thinks about interviews, which is that people just lie. So you're just not, the idea that somehow you're closer to the truth because somebody said it to you in an interview is just backwards. Mm-hmm. So I do tend to rely a lot on written materials. Maybe that's a mistake, but I think my experience with oral histories is they're completely unreliable. Once you start checking, people don't remember things accurately, and they have no stake in remembering them accurately. So your job as an historian is to try to find out what really happened, and usually it's quite different from what people remembered. The exception is that I wrote a piece on Bonnie and Clyde originally for The New Yorker, which I use in the book. This was quite many years ago, and I did interview Arthur Penn, who directed it, David Newman, and Robert Benton, who wrote the screenplay. They were still alive. I think Benton is still alive today. And they gave us time, and we chatted with them. That was helpful. Learned some things that I wouldn't have gotten out of books. But quite a few of these people were still living during the period I was thinking about writing the book, and I sort of avoided interviewing them. The one person I really regret not interviewing, because he was here and he had gotten in touch with me and was available, was Nathan Glazer, who I realized is a constant presence in this period. He collaborated with David Reisman on The Lonely Crowd. He debated with James Baldwin at Commentary. He was at Berkeley during the free speech movement, and he knew all these people. And he would occasionally send me an email about something that I'd written, telling me I'd gotten it wrong. So I thought I should probably. He wasn't always right, by the way, but I thought I should talk to him. He's a nice guy. I'd met him a couple of times. Mm-hmm. I did know quite a few of the New York intellectual figures just because I lived in New York for so long, and I went to Columbia, and so I knew them a little bit, but only one of them was I particularly friendly with. So anyway, I did avoid a lot of interviewing. Occasionally, people would write to me occasionally, and I would find it helpful, and I would footnote them in the book. But I tried not to do that. I sort of regret it because now they're almost all dead, but and you can't interview them. But in a way, I think it was probably better for the integrity of the book.
Yeah, I would say, years earlier when there were other people you could check against, it would sound like a good idea. But when there's only one source and you're stuck with, is he bullshitting me or is he? Yeah. No, Now people get invested in their stories, and they start to believe them. Oh yeah, I've self-mythologized in lots of interesting ways. Are there figures like Glazer who you were just surprised by in terms of the amount of connection and influence that you thought maybe tangentially they'd be interesting, and then discovered that holy crap, there's this whole web of people connected to someone like Glazer?
Glazer was, of course I knew who he was and I knew what he'd done, but I didn't realize how intimately he was connected to some of the key events all the way through the whole period. So that surprised me a little bit. Shouldn't have, maybe. Alfred Kazan, who I did know quite well because we taught at CUNY together. Also, he taught Jack Kerouac. He helped Hannah Arendt get Origins of Totalitarianism published. He was a leading figure in that. He published this anthology of William Blake that was very influential. It's probably the book that Ginsberg read. So I think he's another person I don't do much with, but I think he was more active and visible in the period than I knew when I started out. The person I would say struck me as having way more influence than I would have imagined is John Cage, because he really inspired a lot of people. I find Cage's music unlistenable too, but I
didn't want to say it, but go on.
Yeah, it is. It's totally. But his theories are incredible, and he had just this enormous influence on all kinds of avant-garde figures, not just in music. And he's a really incredibly dominant creative figure in this period. That I didn't know that. That was an interesting thing to learn.
Yeah, I thought the whole Black Mountain College axis, I guess, or node from which people are emanating was fascinating, because it's just something I didn't know very much about at all. So it was honestly, I didn't know that much about it either until I started working on it. And Black Mountain turns out to be a place where just like almost everybody passes through it. And they had a very particular idea about art making that was very influential. The other thing that's also strikes you is how many people went to Black Mountain and other institutions of higher learning on the GI Bill. Almost everybody who's sort of interesting, who was of that age in the 40s and 50s, used the GI Bill and traveled on it and had all kinds of educational experiences they would not otherwise have had. So that's another thing that you tend to forget about the period, is how much the federal government was subsidizing education and art instruction. That's a big deal. Yeah, it reminded me, in fact, when you were talking about the students having an interest in the 50s, at least earlier in your conversation, that you had that great line. I'm completely blanking on who said it now. I'll have to look it up in the PDF. What was great about the 50s was that for one brief moment, nobody understood art. Just that sense that it was, things had become so self-aware and the world was so radically different that you could actually have, this sort of flowering, I guess.
That was Morton Feldman. He was a composer, disciple of Cage's. That was Cage's whole thing. It's like, who knows what the hell it is, And that people felt very inspired. I think one thing we tend to sometimes forget or get wrong about the 50s, because we tend to think of it in a silent generation, conformist kind of paradigm, is that for many, life was starting all over again. The country had been in a depression, it had gone through this war, and suddenly there was peace and prosperity for the first time in 15 years. And people liked the idea of a fresh start. It was very inspiring. So art was one of the things people said, what the hell, we'll just start all over again here. And that was it was a very fecund moment, I think. And that gets lost when we think it's all been suppressed by McCarthyism and so on. There's a lot of that. But there's also a lot of just incredibly imaginative thinking.
Now, in the preface to the book, you mentioned freedom as the slogan of the times of the Cold War. Over the course of the book, were you able to really make sense of what freedom meant and means? And I know at the very end, again, no spoilers, you show the opposite in the very close of it. But did you develop a greater understanding?
I did, but I still don't quite get it. So, so what I say in the preface is, when I was young, I was in high school, freedom was the value. That's what you wanted. You didn't want people to tell you what to do. That's very much part of my personality still. But then when you start to get older and start taking sociology classes and stuff, you realize that it's kind of a problematic concept. And so that's always interested me. What we mean by it when we say, I feel freedom is important as an individual or as a society. But I didn't start out the book. I had a different title in mind when I started, and I only learned as I was writing it how prevalent that term is. It's just used for everything. So, for example, the I Have a Dream speech that King gave in Washington in 1963, which everybody knows, hardly uses the word equality once. I think it appears once or twice in the whole speech, but he uses freedom and liberty many, many times. Now, if you think about it, what the civil rights movement was for was equality. And that was the slogan of the early civil rights reformers before the King's generation. But King saw that the language of freedom is the Cold War language. People respond to that language. And I think it gave his movement a lot more efficacy because he was able to harness the language of freedom. Kennedy, in his inauguration address, uses the word freedom constantly. John Cage uses the word freedom constantly. It's everywhere. And so then you start to think, well, what does it actually mean? If you can use it to describe a certain kind of musical composition and describe the condition of racial segregation and to describe, what the United States stands for in the Cold War, and if you can use it for all those purposes, does it mean anything? So I have to say, and I was curious because I didn't have an answer myself. So I was sort of persuaded by this existentialist, which surprised me. But I felt that the Sartrean idea that freedom consists in making a choice not dictated by your circumstances, what your identity is or what people around you want or even what your emotions tell you to do, but because you choose freely to make the choice, that means something. I don't think you have that kind of freedom absolutely, but I kind of get what he's saying. And then there's a quote that I used as an epigraph from Tom Hayden. We are free to the extent that we know what we are about. That's actually a paraphrase of John Dewey. And it's just an old idea in Western philosophy, which is that freedom comes from transparency, to understanding your social condition. You can accept your social condition. You can be religiously observant or patriotic or whatever, as long as you have accepted it consciously. You aren't doing it because somebody tells you to do it. And I think that is a good definition of what we mean by it. You can't escape your circumstances, but you can understand them. And that's why I'm an educator, because I think that's our job, is to help students, give students the tools for understanding their actual circumstances in life so that they can react consciously to them.
Oh, I went to St. John's College for my master's degree in Annapolis. So I often in my 20s into 30s had to explain to people what the liberal arts education is there for, what great books mean. But,
that's right. That's what it's for. It's to help you see your situation.
Right. Just learning how to learn and how to adapt it. The one thing I do want to say in terms of echoes of the Kennedy era, et cetera, in my day job, I am a lobbyist for a weird part of the pharmaceutical industry. And I just received... Would
that be the good part of the pharmaceutical industry?
Yes. I'll break cover it now. I represent the guys who manufacture drugs and vaccines for the drug companies. So not the guys who just got in trouble in Baltimore, luckily. They used to be a member and they left, but the guys who are doing the doses out in Indiana and Michigan and all those guys, I represent them and help lobby for them. But we just got a bill in that the Senate is working on as part of the big infrastructure thing, and it's titled Endless Frontiers.
Wow.
Yeah, and I just had this kind of Kennedy, but also paradoxical in its very definition. But whatever, endless frontiers, if that's how you want to frame, infrastructure and how we're going to build up, supply chains and all this, that's cool. We'll use your language. But things can be a little rhetorically weird, I guess. The thing that strikes me, when we talk about the existentialists and the sense of an authentic life, I'm reminded. And it's an aspect of the book I had wondered about too, the flip side of the free world, what life was like behind the Iron Curtain, which you address through some of the artists and thinkers who travel there. But I think of Philip Roth blowing up George Steiner in the Paris Review a bazillion years ago, when Steiner was arguing that writers behind the Iron Curtain were more authentic and legit because, they faced the threat of the state. And Roth was like, they all want to flee to the West as fast as possible. They do not feel that is authenticity. That's terror and dread. Right. So this idea that we somehow romanticize certain aspects of that era, one side or the other, is kind of, well, again, your book helps as a great antidote for a lot of that. But is there, you have a line, speaking of that era, you had Isaiah Berlin mentioning that his book on Marx was an opportunity to do homework, basically. I know this is an all-encompassing topic for you, but is the homework the history of the Cold War for you? Is it that notion of what freedom is? Is there, I guess this boils down to, is there an elevator pitch you can give to like a 900-page book when you explain to someone what you're, what you really wanted to write it for?
Yeah, I mean, the purpose of writing a book like this, historical book, is just to bring a vanished world to life on the page so that the reader can go through a looking glass and see what it was like to be alive then. It's a very different time, and a different time and also a similar time. And that's the goal of writing, period. But then in terms of this particular subject, the argument of the book is that, or the theme of the book is the transformation of the United States between 1945 and 1965 from a country that right after the war had an enormous amount of political capital because it led the fight against fascism and then helped to rebuild Western Europe and Japan, but had very little cultural capital. And 20 years later, the situation is reversed. The United States has burned through its political capital and is burning through it in Vietnam, but it's become the center of an increasingly global world culture. And that transformation is what the book tries to explain. How did that happen? The United States went from being more or less a cultural backwater, or considered provincial, inferior to European, Western European culture. How did it go from that to being at the center of world culture? And what political sacrifices did it have to make to get there?
Yeah, the tension between New York and Paris in so many different ways throughout the book is what was the original title? You said you had something else before the free world. Is it something you can tell me?
It was called All Along the Watchtower.
Good, but too Vietnam heavy. But yeah,
it was too Cold War heavy. I mean, one thing that I learned was that the Cold War was much less on people's minds than we think it was. Of course, people thought about it. People thought about the bomb, but it wasn't like everything people did was dictated by some kind of Cold War ideological imperative at all. And so as I wrote the book, I realized All Along the Watchtower suggests a constant state of vigilance, which is not actually what you see on the ground very much. So I thought this was a better frame. Did
you ever read John Crowley's theory of what the song is, by the way? That it's a Mobius loop, where it's starting in the middle, but by the time you get to the end of it, you're back inside it. There must be some kind of way out of this place. Is the two characters going around a loop inside themselves?
I think I have. I don't remember. I think I have seen that.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. But again, it's the when you get into altered states of consciousness and listen to music of the '60s again and again, I guess certain things come out. But now, what's the toughest art form to write about for you? You mentioned having to lead over jazz in that part of it. Are there forms that really make it difficult to render in prose what they are?
I would say music, except for Cage, because the thing about Cage is that it's really the theory. Mm-hmm. You don't have to listen very carefully. so like the silent piece, you're not listening for the silent piece. You're listening. It's an idea. So I would say any art. I'm very conceptual. It's just the way I respond to things. So any art that has a concept behind it, I get. That's why I like Warhol. It's not that I like looking at the soup can. It's like I get the idea of it. Yeah. So to me, those are easier to write about because I'm an intellectual historian. I write about ideas. So if it's more... So with jazz, I feel I could get the theory. I probably wouldn't appreciate the music. So yeah. So anyways, writing about what I was saying, I used to write about movies, and I realized I wasn't good at describing the sensation that you get from watching a movie, which is what most people. I mean, that's the experience. It's the sensation of the color and the sound, the performers and so forth. Whereas if it had a concept, I could get it. Yeah. So Cage was ideal for me for that, and that whole Cage world, because I got what they thought they were doing conceptually.
In the dedication of the book, you dedicate to your father, who you describe as an anti-communist.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little and the influence he and your mom did or didn't have on you in terms of writing and study?
Yeah. Well, my parents were liberal Democrats, and my father was a big Roosevelt supporter and New Deal type Democrat, and they were very anti-war. So when I was a teenager, that was a big topic of discussion in our household, was the war. I tend to try to defend the U.S. in arguments with my father, which he always defeated me in. But he was anti-militarist in general, but he was certainly against the war in Vietnam and occupied a big part of his life. He was a political scientist. He worked for the ACLU, so on. So he had a big influence on my politics. And part of the reason this period is probably more vivid to me than it might be for somebody else my age is just because of my household. That's what we talked about all the time. Anti-communist was basically one way to describe the difference between an anti-communist and anti-communist is Vietnam. Because it wasn't that my father was in favor of communism in Vietnam or in favor of Ho Chi Minh, except as a kind of independence fighter, but he was against intervention in Vietnam, military intervention. And that's what divided the anti-communists and the anti-communists. So early, the split really begins in around 1948 with the creation of the Americans for Democratic Action. And the idea has to do with whether the American response to communism should be interventionist and liberationist, or whether it should be basically containment, let the communists wither of their own inefficiencies. So my father wasn't a communist. He was probably a socialist of some kind, but he also felt the United States had exaggerated the threat of communism and also militarized our foreign policy and wastefully spent, huge amounts of national resources on the Defense Department and military production. So those were his politics.
And you, as you mentioned, you kicked the book off with Kennan and the belief that it's nationalism and xenophobia that was animating Russia in particular, not communism itself.
Yeah.
You subscribe to that? And do you think it continues based on Russia today?
Well, so this, I mean,
to get all geopolitical on you.
Right. No, I don't mind. I just don't want to argue with George Kennan. He knew a lot more than I do. But I would say it was a mix because, of course, the same thing's true of any nation that in a real political view, the nation is interested in preserving its own interests fundamentally. So to the extent it feels threatened by other nations, it's going to react hostilely in a paranoid way. And Stalin was a paranoid person. So it's not surprising, particularly, that he reacted the way he did at the end of the war to what he regarded as potential threats to the Soviet state in creating this Eastern Bloc, which Kennan predicted he would try to do. At the same time, I think it's a mistake not to acknowledge that there was an ideology that they believed in. They really believed in the world historical class struggle and the ultimate triumph of socialism. They didn't think they had to bomb the world to get that. They thought it was just going to happen. But they believed in it in the same way that Americans believed in the ideology of American exceptionalism and freedom. So it's a mistake to think all of their moves were calculated. As somebody put it, a book on the KGB, there was no double bookkeeping in the Kremlin. In other words, the Kremlin didn't have like an official Marxist rationale for their policies and then a sort of secret nationalist rationale. They really thought their nationalism was bound up with their belief in Marxism.
And I just realized now you were of draft age during Vietnam. Were you student deferred, or is this a touchy question to ask somebody?
It's not. No, I'm not running for office, so it wouldn't matter. I was classified 1A, which is draftable when I was in college, and then before I applied to get a 2S, which was the student deferment, they started the lottery, and then I guess it was 1970 or 71, and in the lottery I was like 260 or something like that, which meant that I had no realistic chance of being drafted, which was a great relief. I would have been completely terrified to be sent to Vietnam. Really, I mean, I would have. I was a kid. But so I wasn't terribly worried about being drafted. Of course, it crosses your mind and you think about, could you apply to get a conscientious objector status? Would I have gone to Canada? Da, 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 da. But fortunately for me, the lottery replaced that. And when the lottery replaced the regular selective service, I think it was December 1970, I'm not quite sure. It took a lot of the pressure off campuses because the student activism really died down very quickly after that, because not all the male students were feeling next day they could get a letter.
Yeah, that's, again, I'm in a running group with a couple of men in their late 60s, early 70s. And again, it only occurred to me a few months into it that, wait a second, these guys would have been that age. Yeah. How do you ask appropriately? They were both student deferments, and same thing. Lottery numbers came in high, and then they were low, but it ended in 1973 when they would have been coming up.
Right.
So,
yeah, it did take a lot of the pressure off. That's for sure. We all thought about it. Yeah.
I can imagine. That's the background, and it's another Philip Roth reference to a character getting shipped out for Korea. One of his last novels, one of those little ones where that's basically the threat the college holds over his head. I've got Roth on the brain right now because of the Blake Bailey bio thing. That's, but one of the things I found interesting is that the notion of CIA funding for various movements, it comes up in the late part of the book, and it's sort of seen as not a backdrop or tendrils that reach behind some of the cultural activities and changes. How difficult, I guess, was it to choose where to place that idea in this context, and how to sort of foreground it, and whether it runs the risk of delegitimizing some of the movement?
It did. That's what's I mean, I think it's perfectly placed, because combined with Vietnam, it blew up the whole intellectual world that these people lived in. It turned out it was sort of a sham, and that it was an astonishing moment, and we never completely recovered from it. There was a kind of allegiance between intellectuals and the state that intellectuals just didn't see clearly what role they were playing. And it turned out they were playing a role in foreign policy that they did not choose for themselves. And that the CIA really was everywhere. I mean, it's pretty incredible, the number of organizations that it funded in one way or another. I don't think the CIA's funding had a huge amount of ideological content. In other words, I don't think they were telling people what to say, but they were, as the phrase goes, they were pulling the strings. They were calling the tune to some extent. So that moment when the revelations happened, that's in 1967. People had kind of known for a couple of years this was going on, but 1967 really blew the roof off it, unraveled the whole tapestry of covert funding. That really changed American intellectual life, because it put people in different relationship with the state. It made people in other countries wonder who these intellectuals were and these artists were who were being promoted by the American government. So to me, that's key. And it is, somebody who read the book says, is it a tragedy? It is in a way. We didn't need to do all that stuff. We didn't need to send modernist literature, in translation to these countries, or to secretly subvent the National Student Association. They were fine without us, without the government behind them. And people didn't care about Lionel Trilling. They cared about Elvis Presley, and so it's just we could have conquered the world without all this deception, but we kind of. I think it has. Tragedy seems a little strong, but it's a moment when you suddenly realize, oh my God, what was that all really about?
Yeah, I've got one of my past guests is doing a biography of Peter Matheson now, and I can't wait to find out what as he's really diving in, what comes out in terms of the Paris Review as a cover for this is just
it's crazy, yeah. But the Paris Review probably got money from them. It's not completely clear, but probably did. A lot of it was just propping up organs of independence or dissent or things that were safe from American government's point of view, but suggested that people were free to express their opinions without being censored and so on. Of course, the irony being that these opinions were being promoted by the state, which was not supposed to be sponsoring them.
It's one of the other things I found interesting is a notion within the book where you differentiate between history of ideas and an intellectual history, with the free world falling in the latter category.
Right.
Tempted to pursue the former, the history of ideas? Yeah.
I strongly don't believe in the history of ideas.
Yeah.
No.
Okay. I wasn't sure based on the language in that paragraph. I'm like, it's something you're averse to as a concept.
Yes. History of ideas is books talking to books. Yeah. It's like Hegel wrote this, Marx wrote that, Engels wrote this, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, it's all about what's in the books. First of all, people don't really read books. It's just not the case. And then they misread them. So it's just, you get into very tangled areas when you're trying to understand how one writer responded to another writer. But people fall into that. Historians fall into that. And then secondly, you're eliding the most important aspect of it, which is the conditions of production and reception that shape the form the work takes and then shape the meaning that people attribute to it. And unless you have those pieces in place, you're really not understanding what the work's significance is. You're presentizing it. So yeah, my work is supposed to be intellectual history. It's not supposed to be history of ideas.
Yeah, you mentioned early on the three dimensions of social forces and the on the street events, and then what was going on in people's heads.
Right.
In that respect, is that the last one the toughest thing to capture?
Yeah.
In terms of understanding?
Yeah. We tend to, when we interpret literature and art in particular of the past, it's inevitable that we presentize it because we're trying to respond to it as a work of art. And we belong to a different historical moment. And so we're going to see it differently from the way people saw it when it was originally exhibited or published. And so you're trying the best you can not to respond in a president's way to it. At the same time, you have to be able to explain it. So the soup can is a banal image, but it wasn't a banal image in 1962. And so you have to figure out what was it about the soup can that made it have the effect of a bomb or the Brillo box. And there you have to get back inside the moment as best you can and try to figure out what it was that made people think, oh, this is shocking or startling or great or whatever. The same thing with the drip paintings, stuff like that. So you're taking iconic things, the flag, Jasper Johnson's flag. You're taking iconic images that have become overly familiarized, and you're trying to get back to the moment when they first came into being. And that's the vanished world that you're trying to bring to life. That's what you're trying to take readers back to. That's the hardest part. The funnest part is the first part, which is figuring out what relevant social conditions make it possible for rock and roll to exist, or British pop art or whatever.
Yeah, I had that with Ed Ward, music critic, and he did 2 volumes so far of the history of rock and roll.
Yeah, I know those books.
I haven't looked in your index yet to see if or in your notes to see if you cited him. You did cite a bunch of my other guests. Oh, good. That's like Shahar Pinsker and the cafe life for Jews. I'm like, all my old guests are showing up in his notes. But yeah, like the ways that the rubber shortages during World War II led to touring, or led to having to do records instead of touring because you couldn't drive to, visit around all these venues.
Oh, that kind of stuff is great. I love that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just, it's things that, again, we take for granted that, only existed, in certain eras or only from a certain period on. And the internet seems to accelerate those changes or understandings of what these things were once upon a time. But I guess in that respect, I shudder to ask, because you have just published this book, either another book on the horizon, or could you imagine what post the free world looks like as a book?
Yeah. Well, I hate to say this because I really don't want to do it, but I feel I should write a book about Vietnam. And that'll be the last book I write. But I just think that's just an incredibly interesting. I'm talking about the period between 65 and 75, which is when the U.S., as you said, the U.S. got out in 73, then the war ended in 75. That's partly just because I was a graduate student, and those were meaningful time when you really care about all these things and they get into your life. But partly because there was something about the atmosphere of those years that is just still very vivid to me. So I would like to do something with it. I don't really want to write another 800-page book or even necessarily a 400-page book. So I have to figure out a way to do what I normally do, which is pretty much in the weeds kind of writing in a way that will capture what it is I'm trying to capture. And I can't even define what that is at the moment, but that's a logical next step. Of course, I thought about writing a novel and a screenplay and a memoir and everything, and then I realized that's not what I'm good at. This is what I do. So that's probably what I'll do. Yeah.
And as far as Vietnam goes, and the thread that runs throughout the book, where do you fall on post-colonialism and Cold War in terms of duck or rabbit? One being either the great powers are fighting through these deteriorating colonies, or the colonies' deterioration is what led to the consolidation of great powers.
Right. No, that's good. So I say this: the duck or rabbit of post-war history. Is it about decolonization or is it about superpower rivalry? And I think that by far the movement with the greatest impact was decolonization. We're still living in the consequences of that moment. It's like a big bang in reverse. I mean, between 1945 and 1970, dozens and dozens of independent states came into being, which have been former colonies. And that just changed the geopolitical map forever. And it also set in motion trains of immigration and so on that are, clearly important issues 50 years later. So I think the great power rivalry thing, and certainly the ideology issues behind it, which is better, liberal democracy or socialism, that's faded compared to the impact of decolonization. So part of the aim of the book is to remind readers how important this global movement was in a period when most Americans were looking inward about racial relations. It really was a global phenomenon of which the American Civil Rights Movement was an interesting adjunct chapter.
In that respect, do you see contemporary U.S.-China relations as a sign of post-colonialism or a reprise of great power rivalry? Because in a sense, you could say China is, going through the, getting away from its colonial, not colonial history, but subjugated history in the industrial age.
Yeah. I think, that really dates to Mao, but the country shackled itself in Maoist ideology for a very long time. And then it, managed to free itself somewhat. And now it's going through this incredible period of growth. But just to your main point, I think the main difference is that there's no real ideological fight. What made the Cold War in the early period I write about, the first 20 years of the Cold War, an intense period intellectually is because people really didn't know what side they were on. There were a lot of intellectuals in particular and artists who were very sympathetic to the Soviet experiment that fades with Stalinism, but doesn't get replaced completely by belief in capitalism. So people like my parents, there's a lot of socialist type thinking of people who are perfectly patriotic, but are very skeptical of liberal capitalism. I don't think that's what's going on with China. It's a trade war. And people don't think like, oh, I wish I was Chinese, or they have a better system. They just think that we've got to get the upper hand naturally because, our interests are involved. So I think that's what makes, you could call any rivalry between major powers a Cold War, but what made the Cold War was it was actually about art and ideas.
Mm-hmm. And outside of the fact that it's derailed the book tour you would have gone on for this, how's your pandemic? How have you been holding up?
We're lucky. I mean, my son was a medical student and was doing rotations in hospitals the entire pandemic, but he's fine. And my daughter-in-law she's a doctor and also was doing rotations. So I was worried for them, but they're fine. And we live in a cocoon in Cambridge because everybody wears a mask and there's a lot of good food around. And it feels I feel a little privileged, to be honest. We're a little bored, and we're very eager to travel. I think probably the experience most professionals have had.
Did you find yourself taking up any art form or, book you'd always meant to get to? Was there any sort of as long as I'm living in captivity, I'm going to do X, Y, or Z?
I did, yeah. So I cooked more than I normally do. I'm a terrible cook, but I did cook a bit. That's another thing that probably most people ended up doing more than they thought they would. And then I started, when I finished the book April 1st last year, which is a good time to finish because I couldn't go to the library after that. And then I started reading all these books that had been coming out that my friends have been reading that I just couldn't get around to. So I've read Elena Ferrante, Hilary Mantel, which I think is the Wolf Hall books, which are fantastic. And I read the first volume of Knausgaard. I'm going to read more. So I'm reading these books that I just didn't have time for. Just
you really
were
for going for 10 years on this. You're capturing all the things from the last bunch. That's
right. So I missed that 10 years. I'm trying to catch up.
Yeah. Did you have to do much travel for research for this, or were things pretty much available in Cambridge?
Well, Harvard has great collections of manuscripts and stuff. And then, most libraries will photocopy or PDF materials if you request them. So I got a lot of stuff that way, which was great. I did do some archival research in person. But I also had a student who went out to LA and looked at Susan Sontag's archive. And I went to the Getty. The Getty has great stuff for my purposes in California, so a little bit. But fortunately, you don't have to go there unless you're just going to sit there and read everything, which I didn't want to do. You don't really need to travel that much anymore because of the services that you can get online. And also a lot of stuff is digitized as well.
Yeah, that's what I wondered, whether there's that necessity for this sort
of book. No, I don't think so. I could never have done it if I had to travel.
And again, everything went off the rails right at the end of the process. But is there anyone you wish there was just a little more historical record of? That I wish I could answer this question, or just somebody you would have included if there was, a fuller biographical.
That's a great question. There's one figure that I really wanted. He's a minor figure in the book, but I really wanted to know a little bit more about. His name was Donald Allen. So Donald Allen was the editor of a volume called The New American Poetry, which was part of this, what I call the Anthology Wars, around 1960. Yeah, and he was an editor of Grove Press. He was turned out to be an important figure in publishing and in editing and in sort of curating contemporary American poetry. And he's from Iowa, and he knew the Berkeley poets and San Francisco Renaissance poets, and so he was so. I just never was able to put all the pieces together for him. And then a student of mine found that there's an archive of his stuff out in California, but it was too late to visit it. So that's a kind of example. I'm sure there's other people I'm forgetting, but often you'll run into a character and you'll think, oh, this could be really interesting, like the Advent calendar thing where you open the windows. This could be really interesting. And then you just can't get into the room. It does happen a lot. So you put together bits and pieces, but you can't really get the whole story.
Yeah. Last question. Is misprision part of transmission?
For sure, yeah.
That's my assumption, but I just want to, it comes up. I just want to make sure that's how things are actually, a map of misreading as
it is a map of misreading. Yeah, that's the problem with the books talking to books approach. It's that people take what they want. Jean-Paul Sartre had no stake in American fiction. He took what he wanted from it. Half of what he said, he made up. I mean, that's not what I think is going on, but it meant something to him, and he was able to transform that with other things into, a philosophy of life. And that's what you're interested in historically, is how this stuff gets misread or misinterpreted or interpreted such that something else is possible. And those are almost always fascinating stories.
Yeah, there's been a series of Twitter threads of people telling stories about attending Derrida lectures. You're not on. I'm thankful you're not on Twitter because you never would have been able to finish writing this book if you were. But yeah, there are these tales of like we didn't know what he was saying.
Yeah.
He was talking about cows, and eventually we figured out it was chaos. And just
Yeah. Well, Derrida is a good example where people think they know what he said, but actually they mostly don't. Yeah.
Yeah, and I went to Hampshire College for my undergraduate in the late 80s and early 90s, so I got the full. Well,
I'll bet.
I was happy to get your fuller picture of theory, deconstruction, and everything else, as opposed to the weaponized version.
That's what happened to it. You're totally right. Boy, you really had the liberal education experience, didn't you?
It was the exact opposite. I went from Hampshire, where it was, again, to quote Harold Bloom, school of resentment and alienation, and where everything was a critique of Western society without actually knowing the books. And then I went to St. John's and actually learned the books and thought, you can critique it once you actually know what you're talking about, but it really doesn't work if you're just,
critique is part of the tradition. That's what people don't understand. The whole mode of critique is part of the Western tradition. It critiques itself.
Again, as a Jew, this is my thing. This is all we do is criticize, usually from our mothers, but it can come from other sources too, Talmud, etc.
It's part of the tradition. Yeah.
So, Louis, thank you so much for coming on. The book is phenomenal, and I'm
thank you.
Even though I didn't know how big it was going to be when I first pitched you on recording, and then saw 880 pages, I'm so thankful because this thing was absolutely illuminating. So,
thank you so much.
This was a great conversation. Thanks.
Thank you.
And that was Louis Menand. His new book is The Free World, Art and Thought in the Cold War from FSG. Comes out today, which is April 20th, 2021 for you time travelers out there. It's a breathtaking piece of work and important in helping us understand how we are, where we are as a global culture. I'm big on understanding the roots and context of things as opposed to just their immediate phenomena. So a book like this really helps establish the foundations of the world as we know it. I hope you'll give it a read. You should also check out Louis' writing in The New Yorker, as well as his previous books like The Metaphysical Club. You can find all that stuff by visiting his site, louismenand.com, which is LOUISMENAND.com. I'll have a link to that in the show and episode notes for this one. And as befits someone who has time to research and write a book as big as The Free World, Louis does not appear to be on social media at all, and that should be a lesson to us. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show by telling other people about it and by sending me postcards, letters, emails, or by leaving me a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. I don't get those as incoming calls. I just get them as voicemails. You have 3 minutes to leave me a message if you go that way. However you reach out, tell me what you like and don't like about the show. Tell me who you'd like to hear me record with, or what movie, TV show, book, music, comic, whatever that you think I should turn listeners on to. And if you've got money to spare, don't give it to me. I do have a Patreon, but I always tell people, you really shouldn't give me money right now because my job treats me just fine. My expenses are really low. And frankly, there are a lot of other individuals and institutions in need. And you can find those individuals through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo. If you're looking to start somewhere with institutions or foundations, look to your local food bank or the Poor People's Campaign, Freedom Funds. There are a lot of different things you can give to that can help try to make a better world. So I hope you'll help. Also, I still have some copies left of the first issue of my very first zine, Haiku for Business Travelers. If you want one, just drop me a line or visit haikuforbusinesstravelers.com and hit me up that way. It's free. You can kick in a few bucks if you want for postage and production, but it's just me sharing my art, such as it is. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.